18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago, I was actually coaching somebody who's a neurodiversity coach herself. She picked up on the fact that actually she felt very certain that I had ADHD. I felt offended.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I felt offended. But I looked at the traits and behaviours and, Garry, I was ticking them off like a shopping list. Well, actually, it's not just because you're not very smart and it's not just because you're lazy. There's a reason for this, so what can you do about it? ADHD is a lifelong condition. There's the inattentive type, there's the hyperactive impulsive type, and then there's the combinations. And actually the name Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder is very misleading because I don't have an attention deficit in some ways. Do you often miss details? Do you tend to look at big picture and get bored with the detail? Are you disorganised? Do you forget stuff? Do you have a poor attention span? Does your brain feel like you've got 25 computer tabs open on it all of the time?
Welcome to the Business Sense podcast. I'm Garry Crosby. This is the podcast where we make sense of the business journey by talking to owners about what they've learnt along the way. Let's jump into today's episode. Welcome, Bev. Thanks for spending some time with me this morning.
It's my pleasure.
Now, I'm really looking forward to this because I know that you've spent the last 5 years at least talking about to employers about how to support women going through the menopause. But you've changed tack recently. Tell me what's going on now and what factors led to that change.
So I call myself an accidental entrepreneur, Garry, because I didn't start my business until I was 52, as you know, and I'm 57 now. So you're right, it's exactly 5 years. It was 5 years in April, 1st of April that I started the business. But it was never planned. I left work because of menopause symptoms. I was struggling and worked a long, long time for the MOD, 32 years for the MOD, so Air Force, as a civilian, so a background you know very well. Menopause hit when I turned 50 with a vengeance. And after 2 years, I was struggling and I ended up leaving the job. And I didn't really have a plan, which is probably quite true of the whole of my life, if I'm honest, looking back. But I knew I didn't want to be working full time. I had too many symptoms that were causing me problems. And a strange irony, I guess, not long after I'd left work, an ex-colleague of mine that I'd worked with in the learning and development world put my name forward as somebody that might be interested in delivering some menopause training. I'd kind of done a lot of research of my own over, the last 2 years. And it was Air Command, the Royal Air Force's head office, which is quite ironic, who were looking for somebody to deliver menopause awareness training for some managers and some colleagues. And I had a training background. They couldn't find anybody. We're going back 5 years. Everybody seems to be talking about menopause in the workplace now, but nobody was then. And I somehow managed to find myself saying, yeah, okay, give me a few weeks. I'll do a bit of research, put something together. And I ended up delivering 2 workshops at Air Command in High Wycombe on the 18th of October 2018, which is actually World Menopause Day every year. And that started the kind of the thought process around, I'd forgotten how much I enjoy being in a classroom and delivering training because I hadn't done that for a few months. But also, more importantly, why were the Air Force, a very male-dominated organisation, focusing on menopause? And of course, it was very real in my life at that point as well. And I drove back from High Wycombe with a bit of a plan. Well, I wouldn't even call it a plan, an idea in my head around, is there a bigger need for this sort of training? Is anybody else doing it? Is this something that I could maybe start using to bring some income in? Because I'd started as a health coach, but it's very, very difficult to get people to invest in their own health. And it was hard work. And that was really how it happened. And I think very soon after that, I started networking, going out and asking around if anybody was doing anything with menopause and getting some very strange looks from some very, very white middle-aged men, no disrespect. And this is where I met you. I think you were probably one of my very, very first interactions with networking. I came to one of your workshops and, started to get a bit of an understanding about what business is all about and realised at the time that I had no plan, didn't know what I was doing, needed help. And it just sort of escalated from there. And after so that was, October 2018 in reality. So although I'd been left work 5 years, I haven't actually been doing this. Probably
and
4.5 years.
There was a queue of big companies who wanted to hear how they could help.
There was. Once I started sort of doing some research and setting up a LinkedIn profile. I'd never been on LinkedIn. It all felt really scary and way too professional for me. But I started putting stuff out on LinkedIn and suddenly realised that people were coming to me, and the work with the Air Force led to a much bigger contract with the Air Force, and I was travelling all over the country, up to Scotland and, all of the Air Force bases around. And then I got contacted by people like L'Oreal UK. And, over the last 5 years, I've been so privileged to work with some amazing companies like Amnesty International and Channel 4. And it's a really good sort of partnership with Channel 4 on some e-learning. But your question about the fact that it's changed, if it's all going so well, what on earth made me decide to change?
Yeah.
Because I've actually made the decision, and I went live last week to my clients, my ex-clients, my sort of LinkedIn following, my social media following, to say, okay, this is closing in October. There's a beautiful, beautiful loop here. My very first client was Air Command on the 18th of October, as I've said. And they'll also be my very last client on the 18th of October this year.
Wow.
So that sort of 5-year loop will close. And it feels like, that just kind of feels, that's a nice closure. I was diagnosed with ADHD in January this year. It feels like a quick divert there. But
No.
This is where the change has happened. I think probably 18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago, I was actually coaching somebody who's a neurodiversity coach herself.
Right.
And I was coaching her around things like time management and organisation, which is farcical because they're my biggest problems. But you don't have to be an expert to coach. And during that coaching, she picked up on the fact that actually she felt very certain that I had ADHD. And if I'm honest, I was a bit resistant. I felt a little bit offended because my stereotypical idea of what ADHD was that it was a defect, that it only really happened to little naughty boys who couldn't sit down and stay still at school. So once I got over myself and started to do a bit more research, which is my thing, I started to look at the traits and the behaviours. I don't like calling them symptoms because I don't think of it as an illness. But I looked at the traits and behaviours, and Garry, I was ticking them off like a shopping list. And last September, so September 22, I ended up doing a TEDx talk, must be correct about that, it's a TEDx talk, about the link that I kind of realised there was a very strong link in terms of hormonal changes for women with ADHD, diagnosed or undiagnosed, when they hit perimenopause and the hormonal changes that happen there. And they kind of collide. And there was very little research that I could find that really spoke about how these two things come together. So for a lot of us, I mean, ADHD is a lifelong condition. You don't develop it, you're born with it.
It can't be cured.
No, well, you can't cure something if it's not an illness. And I don't see it as an illness. I just see it as a brain difference. It's a different way of thinking.
So do people suffer from ADHD, or do they just
I think they don't
with it?
suffer from ADHD. I think they suffer from a world that isn't designed for people with neurodiverse brains.
Right.
So the suffering, I think, comes from trying to fit into a system that doesn't fit our way of thinking. And that can lead to feelings of sort of shame, problems with your own self-worth, feelings of inadequacy. So, not being able to do some of the basic things that seem so simple in a world that values those simple things. So no, I don't, it can't be cured. I think you can manage it. And certainly I'm on medication now that helps to manage the traits. But so I did the TEDx talk. I must remember it's not a TED talk. And that really sort of changed the trajectory of my own life, I suppose. So I was starting to come to terms with a lot of the ways I've been all my life and rationalising, well, actually, it's not just because you're not very smart and it's not just because you're lazy. There's a reason for this. So what can you do about it? If it's not a character trait, if it's something that you can change the behaviours, what can you do about it? And a sort of, I guess, the process that led me to where I am now is I'd ended up doing the menopause training by chance, not by choice. And I'm through that part of my life now at 57. So whilst I still think there's a load of work still needs to be done in the workplace, and I'm very passionate about women in the workplace being supported, I don't feel like I've still got that fire in my belly, I guess, because it's not affecting my day-to-day life in the way it did. But ADHD is.
So let's go back to that moment when you were coaching somebody who was obviously aware of ADHD, and they started to think that they were spotting those symptoms in you. What was it that person saw, and how did they raise it with you? Because that must have been an interesting conversation.
It was a horrible moment for me as a coach, because I did something that no coach should do. I made a big assumption. She was telling me about the problems she was having, and she was attributing them to her ADHD. She's also undiagnosed autistic, but very strong traits. And she's a good friend as well. And I said, I'm not going to say her name, but I said, I'm hearing what you're saying. You're saying you can't organise yourself, and you struggle with keeping your desk tidy and meeting, appointments. But I don't think that's ADHD, because I do that as well. And she just burst out laughing and said, I would bet my mortgage in my house that you have ADHD.
So, and I know that for a long time ADHD was the subject of a very fierce debate about whether it actually was a condition or not. And I think the medical system has agreed now, and it is reported in the American Manual for the Mental Disorders and things like that.
DSM-5.
Yeah. Did you, at that point when this person said that to you, was there a light bulb that went on? You said you were diagnosed, no. So did you go and have a proper diagnosis?
Yeah, not immediately. The light bulb didn't go on immediately. I guess a bit of sort of resistance went on. I felt offended.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I felt offended. And it wasn't really until I started to do a bit more research. I think I'm quite self-aware. So if somebody throws something back at me, once I get over myself, I will kind of think, okay, where did that come from?
Yeah.
So I started doing what we always do. I dived on Google, read a few books, listened to a few podcasts, and then the light bulb went off, I think, when I started to realise that it wasn't what I thought it was. And it was my ignorance about what ADHD is. And actually the name Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder is very misleading, because I don't have an attention deficit in some ways. I can hyper-focus and pay attention brilliantly to things I'm interested in. I'm just not so good on the things that I find boring, like the details. And
I mean, the DSM-5, I did have a quick look yesterday, but it seems to split it into two groups of 9. And the first bit, the attention deficit, the inattentiveness, if you like, seems to be a bit more focused on children, whereas the second group of 9 appears to be a little bit more...
I think it's the other way around, Gary. So there are 3 types of ADHD. You used to have ADD, Attention Deficit Disorder, and that's kind of all been subsumed into this term ADHD. Right. Okay. So yes, there's the inattentive type, there's the hyperactive impulsive type, and then there's a combination. What tends to happen is the hyperactivity often shows up in childhood, but as we get older, we find ways to manage that hyperactivity. Or, we realise that society isn't very keen on us just getting up and walking around in meetings. And so we adapt and we get very, very good at masking a lot of those symptoms.
Got it.
So, I was diagnosed in January. I did decide to go down the diagnosis route. And that in itself was quite a big decision, because at 50, I was 56 at the time. I was thinking, well, what's a diagnosis going to give me? I can go down the list of traits and tick them all off. I don't really think I need a psychiatrist to tell me there's something wrong with me and stick a label on me.
All right.
But there were a few other things that kind of kept playing in my mind. One was validation, I guess. Also, I'd done this TEDx talk before I was diagnosed, and I thought, actually, it's getting some traction on Google and on YouTube rather. And I don't actually have any definitive, yes, you have got ADHD. I felt a little bit like a fraud, I suppose. So the diagnosis was terrifying, if I'm honest. I went privately because if you do it through the NHS in the UK, it can take 2 or 3 years.
So talk me through it. I mean, what was the process like? What did you have to go through?
So I was very lucky having my friend who is, quite well versed in all of this. So she gave me some good pointers. So I read the DSM-5 before I started. You can download it, and although it's an American criteria, it is sort of universally recognised. It's kind of worldwide
authority, isn't it? Yeah.
I read very briefly about the DSM-5. The reason I didn't go into it more deeply is because actually I didn't want to go into the diagnosis and the assessment with a preconception of what they might ask me, and therefore didn't want to skew my answers to what I thought they might want to hear. So basically, I found a company called ADHD 360. I'm not sort of advertising them. They were just one that caught my eye. I liked the way they seemed to work. Booked the diagnosis, or the assessment rather, in September, I think, last year. And I had the assessment in January, on Friday the 13th. Don't know if that's significant. And it was 90 minutes on a Zoom call with a psychiatric nurse who had trained and specialised in ADHD. Okay. And he was brilliant. And it wasn't the assessment that was scary. The biggest fear for me was that I would go through the assessment and at the end of it, they'd say I didn't have ADHD. And if I couldn't attribute the way I'd been to ADHD, then maybe I am just stupid and lazy. And that was terrifying. So I went through the 90-minute conversation, and it was very relaxed. There were a few tears by me, not the nurse. Although to be fair, he did get a little bit emotional with me at one point. But he just asked me lots of questions based around those 9 areas. And at the end, he said, "Okay, would you like to hear my assessment?" And I thought, "I've paid for it. Yes, I would."
Crikey, yeah.
And he said, "I can categorically, hand on heart, state you most certainly do have ADHD." Right. And I just lost it completely. Right. Emotional breakdown at the end of it. It was like this massive sense of relief and just, I think, pent-up emotions from sort of the months and months leading up to it. And then it turned to anger, which is really interesting.
To anger? Go on, tell me more about that.
I just felt really angry at the fact that I was now 56. So my assessment was the 13th of January. My birthday's the 19th of January. So I was just 56. I was 57 a week later. And it just kept going back through my mind. Why wasn't I picked up earlier? Why have I spent this many years struggling and hiding and masking? And how different my life might have been if it had been picked up earlier. So I guess it's that whole change curve, isn't it? It's going through the kind of getting to the point of acceptance. And I got there very quickly, if I'm honest. The anger didn't last very long. And part of that acceptance was, okay, where does this leave you now? What are you going to do with this knowledge?
Well, you used the word earlier, label, which I thought was quite interesting. Do you feel like this label has now been applied to you in some way?
Yes. Yeah, but not all labels are bad, are they? I think if the label allows us to be a bit more accepting and have a bit more grace for ourselves, then it's not a bad thing. I think the problem comes when we use the label as an excuse to not do the things we need to do. Yeah. And that was another thing that I really struggled with, that idea of, is this an excuse or is it an explanation? And it could be either. That's down to personal attitude, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, I've got this label now. That means I know I'm rubbish with money. I don't have to worry about that. Now I know, actually, there's an explanation for why I really struggle with the fine detail and the minutiae of managing my finances. So what am I going to do with that? Yeah. What systems can I put in place to help me? Who can I use? I've got a great accountant and a great bookkeeper. So I've got systems that I can tap into. So the label is really, for me, it was a validator.
And so you come out of the meeting on the 13th, you go through that the shock, maybe a little bit of denial, the anger about the fact that it's lain undiagnosed for a very long time. I guess at that point you're starting to think about, well, what next? You know, what does it mean, and what do I have to do at this point? What did you go through as you were thinking about that?
So I'd really struggled for about 6 months with what I now look back and realise was burnout. I'd been working on my business and in my business for nearly 5 years. And I think I just kind of got to the point where I was quite burnt out. I think this is quite common for...
Pretty full on, isn't it?
Yeah, for small business owners especially. And I got to the point where I was... It sounds awful. I was dreading a client coming and asking me to do some work.
Right.
And I thought, this can't be right. Everybody dreams of getting clients wanting to work with them. Why am I resisting this? Why am I getting, anxiety when I get a sales inquiry?
Yeah.
And sat down, and I'm a huge one for journaling and kind of trying to go a little bit inside and figure out what's going on the outside, because it's normally a reflection of what's going on in your head, but you don't always see it as obvious. So I actually went on a 2-week cruise to the Caribbean in January, which was lovely.
Sounds
but
lovely.
The beauty was Wi-Fi was virtually non-existent. So I had very little option but to completely unplug.
Right.
And it gave me 2 weeks to really just think about, what my life was going to be and what I wanted it to be. And actually my diagnosis was the 13th of July. That was the Friday. We flew to Jamaica for our cruise on the Monday. So it was literally so fresh in my mind.
Wow.
And I came back from the cruise realising that if I wasn't loving what I'm doing, it's not fair on me, it's not fair on my husband Mark, it's really not fair on my clients. If I can't feel like I'm giving them 100% of me, I mean, I don't think it ever showed up in my delivery. I would like to think I was still delivering as well as I ever had. But if I wasn't loving the process, something had to change. And I knew menopause, I'd moved through it. It's transient. ADHD is going to be with me the rest of my life. So I sort of sat down on holiday and thought, what are my strengths? What am I good at? What have I done? And I realised that actually I've made a pretty good fist of building a business. I don't profess to be a business strategist in any way, but I think I can definitely recognise that there are struggles when you start a business, and there are even bigger struggles if you start a business as a woman with ADHD, whether you know you've got it or not. So the business formed in my head to go back to coaching, which is my first love, and define a new business whereby I'm coaching women with ADHD to start and scale their business, their first business. I don't feel like I'm so far through the process that I've forgotten what it's like to really struggle in the early days. But I feel like I've learned so much in the last 5 years that I can bring to those women who maybe are stuck in a job. For somebody with ADHD, and I'm talking generically here, it's not going to be true for everybody with ADHD, but we make bloody good, am I allowed to say that? Entrepreneurs. Bloomin' good entrepreneurs. We've got all of the traits that make a great entrepreneur. We're great in chaos and the uncertainty. We love it. We thrive on it. We're great at risk. We will take risks that where we're impulsive. If we can manage that from the side of, when it gets out of hand, they're actually great traits. So I think there are a lot of women, and I've spoken to a lot of women, who are stuck in 9-to-5 jobs, feeling boxed in, who would love to get out and do things for themselves, but worry that the areas that they think they're weak in might hold them back.
Sure. So
that's where the new business is formed, and I've built a model called Adapt around it, which is really about looking at sort of a start to finish process, an iterative process we can keep going through.
I do want to talk about that, but I just want to go back into the journey, because you must have come out of that session with the psychiatric nurse. Maybe they told you that there were options for treatment and things like that. I'm thinking about when people are, they see themselves in the symptoms that they've read in the book. They go and have the assessment. They get told that they've got ADHD. What kind of options do they have at that point? What kind of options did you have at that point?
Yeah. I mean, medication is an option. And whilst I don't see ADHD as a medical issue, There are medications that can help you focus. A bit like we drink caffeine to help, keep us focused.
Yeah.
Caffeine doesn't work for me, and I found out since sort of doing the research that part of the problem is that caffeine boosts some of the chemicals in the brain. And if your chemicals in the brain are at an optimum level most of the time anyway, and you boost it with caffeine, you get like a boost. If you've got an ADHD brain that's already deficient in some of those chemicals, all caffeine does really is bring you back up to where normal people would be. Right. Normal people, that's not the way to put it, isn't it? So caffeine didn't work. So there are sort of amphetamine-based drugs, Ritalin and things like that, that what they actually do is stimulate the dopamine in the brain, because people with ADHD have a dysregulation in dopamine production.
Right.
So most of the time we're craving the dopamine that we need to keep us motivated. We're not processing the dopamine properly. So medication is an option. Coaching, counselling, all of those sort of talking therapy type interventions can help. Certainly finding good strategies and working with a good coach who understands ADHD, I think, is really important. There's some really good coaching techniques that just don't work for somebody with an ADHD brain.
No. I was thinking about whether or not, coming out of that assessment on the 13th of January and heading off on the cruise and thinking to yourself, now that I know this, there are steps I can take myself before I take some of the other steps that might be available, talking to someone else or taking the medication route. Do you feel like once people are diagnosed with ADHD, that is in itself a release, and they can start to think about how they approach the world?
I can only talk for me.
With that knowledge.
I don't know how it affects other people. I think some people might find it quite challenging to get the confirmation. For me, it was definitely empowering because it meant that I could then start to think about, what can I do about this myself? So I think for me, that process of going through the diagnosis was very empowering, and it gave me options. And I can't speak for anybody else. My brother, I'm fairly certain, has got ADHD. There are very strong familial connections with ADHD. He's 62. He's adamant he doesn't need any kind of diagnosis. He thinks, he feels comfortable that if they are the traits and that's what he's got, then so be it. He's lived with it for 62 years. What's a diagnosis going to do other than, put a little hole in his bank account because it's not cheap to go privately. Right. But for me, it was empowering. Yeah. It gave me, it felt like it gave me choice, and I have chosen to medicate. That was something that I went away for the 2 weeks on the cruise to just kind of.
And so, I guess again we have, as you say, we have to focus on your experience of it. But was it either before or after the diagnosis disruptive to your life?
I think it's been disruptive to my life all of my life.
Right.
Has it been disruptive to my life since the diagnosis? It depends whether you're talking disruptive as in a negative or a positive. It's certainly disrupted my business, but I would see that as a positive disruption.
Yeah, I was thinking about, as I said at the beginning, do people suffer from ADHD? And you said you don't want to medicalize it, but if they're not suffering, does it disrupt them in a way where they say, okay, I recognise what's happening here, and I need to take action to fix that? Yeah,
I think there are so many factors at play here as to whether somebody suffers because of ADHD. Richard Branson's got ADHD. Right. Don't know that it's been a particular drawback for him. No. I think there's lots of things. If you've been, if it's been a limitation in your life, if you've felt in any way that the traits of ADHD, whether you've recognised them as ADHD or not, have held you back, if they've left you feeling ashamed for some of your traits, then undoubtedly it would have had a negative effect. I think if you've had a family and an educational support system that encouraged you despite those behaviours, it's going to have a very different outcome than if you've had an upbringing, a background that has, been put you down because of those traits. So there's so many things as to whether, so many factors that would lead to whether it's a challenge or not. And part of the reason I struggled, I think, initially to acknowledge that I could have ADHD is because I've always had pretty good self-esteem. And everything I was reading was saying, if you have ADHD, you're more prone to anxiety and depression and, all of these sort of mental health issues that I'd not experienced. But I realised I had a very loving upbringing that probably put me in a better position from a self-esteem point of view. Although I have spent many, many adult years, and I know we've spoken about this before, thinking I'm not very clever, thinking I'm not very smart because I struggle with some of the basics, and not really acknowledging the strengths that I have. That's the biggest disruptor, if you like, is the fact that I've had to disrupt my self-talk about, my intelligence and what I bring to the world, which sounds a bit deep, but.
So if we've got somebody who's, and I do want to talk about your ADAPT system, but let's just imagine there is somebody who's watching this and they're thinking, I'm kind of recognizing some of what's being said, but I need to kind of understand better what the traits are, to use your word. I agree that's better than symptoms. If somebody's watching, what should they be looking out for? What are we talking about when we're talking about ADHD?
Yeah. So I think there are, if you look at the DSM-5, and I would probably say go and dig out the DSM-5 on Google and look at what the questions are. Yeah. But a lot of the traits are around things like disorganization, poor memory, not being able. It's a working memory issue as much as anything else as well. So executive functioning elements of the brain. Yeah. So often it's things like detail. Do you often miss details? Do you tend to look at big picture and get bored with the detail? Are you disorganized? Do you forget stuff? Do you have a poor attention span? You don't have this question in the DSM-5, but one of the things that I kind of, the visual elements that I kind of say is, does your brain feel like you've got 25 computer tabs open on it all of the time and different programs running all of the time? Yeah. And interestingly, I think the medication for me closed a few of those tabs down. That's about all it's done so far. Okay. But the traits, and they're very different. So a lot of the attention elements are around executive functioning. And then you've got things like impulsivity. We are much more prone to addiction. Because of that dopamine need. We're craving dopamine all of the time. Yep. So impulsive actions, risky actions, talking a lot, interrupting people. Right. We're not very good at holding something in our head for later. It has to happen now.
So you kind of blurt out.
Yeah.
Or you just, whatever, just like I did there.
Yeah.
Whatever
we can talk about this later, Garry.
Yeah, whatever comes into your head, it has to come out straight away.
And at the end of the day, we conform to a societal expectation. So over the years, most of us, I think, with ADHD will adapt some of those traits and behaviours to fit. But whereas they may come naturally to a neurotypical person, it's actually quite exhausting doing that all of the time, which is why, a lot of children, I'm absolutely convinced my granddaughter has ADHD. She shows all of the signs. And yet when her mum chatted to her teacher, she said, oh, no, she sits lovely and quietly in school and, she's very attentive. But I've had a conversation with her. She's 8. She can talk about this quite easily now. She's like, I have to tap my foot, Nanny. I have to tap my foot so I stay focused. Like, okay, so you're finding strategies even at 8 to, they call it stimming. She's finding strategies to fit in. But she comes home and she's like an explosion. She's got so much energy and she can't sit upright on a sofa. She hangs with her head, feet up and head down. And it's her releasing all of that, that sort of pent up masking that she's had to do all day. I think I've gone off track, Garry, sorry.
No, it's fascinating because we talked about the assessment that you had, the diagnosis, your choices for the treatment, things like that, and what people should be looking out for, because I think, it's useful for people to see in themselves or in others what those kind of symptoms are. There's quite a big discrepancy in percentage ADHD reporting in different countries. What could be the explanation for that?
I think misdiagnosis is huge. Overdiagnosis when it's possibly not ADHD. There are discrepancies. I don't know what the percentage is of the number of people that have ADHD. I think it's higher than we think, and I don't think it's all of the people that are diagnosed. I think diagnosis in females is much more difficult because the DSM-5 criteria is still pretty much focused on children and boys. It wasn't even recognised in women until not that long ago.
No.
I think more women have ADHD than we realise, and they mask very, very well. I think girls in general, and again, I probably shouldn't stereotype here, but I think in general, they learn much more quickly what's acceptable. Sit down, be quiet, don't speak up, don't have an opinion. I don't want to get all feminist in this, but that there are different expectations placed on girls that carry through their life. I read a brilliant book actually called Hunters in a Farmer's World, and they talk about people with ADHD as being hunters and having hunter traits. It's an analogy, but actually, if you look back at the kind of historically, the hunter and the farmer, the agriculturist, they're very similar traits to neurotypicals and neurodiverse with ADHD. It's a brilliant book. I can't remember who it's by though. So I think in terms of diagnosis, we're not using the right criteria. And now I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not suggesting that I know better, but certainly all of the DSM-5 traits, I would not have been picked up as a child because I didn't display most of them overtly. I probably did inside, but overtly I didn't.
Let's talk about your model then, because I'm really keen to understand what that is. People who have either been told by somebody else that they've got ADHD, or perhaps they've had the diagnosis done properly. I guess there's lots of ways for them to get support, but how will you be providing support to them?
Yeah, it's quite niche. I'm not really wanting to work with women who have been already successful in business. That's not what I want to do. But I think for me, I realised quite early on, probably from one of your workshops quite early on, that I couldn't do things on my own. I needed help.
Yeah.
So that's I don't now understanding, and it's so fresh in my mind, understanding the journey, both the business side of it and the ADHD side. Yeah. I specifically want to work with women, as I said, who are wanting to start a business or who've started in the very, very early days, but their ADHD traits are probably holding them back and keeping them stuck. So it will be coaching, a bit of mentoring.
Yeah.
I'm a trainer, so there'll be training elements in there, a bit of a hybrid.
Yeah.
And I've kind of looked at the process. We always need a process. I think, you read any good business book and they've got a model in there. And the model that I've kind of defined and designed that I think fits from my perspective as well is the ADAPT model. And the reason I call it ADAPT is a bit of a play on words of attention deficit disorder, ADD-APT. And because I think one of the big strengths of people with ADHD is our adaptability. We can adapt to chaos. We adapt to uncertainty very, very well. We've had to adapt to fit in all through our lives.
Yeah.
So shall I very, very briefly go through what each of the adapt stages are? Is that all right? So it's kind of a two-stage process. The AD at the beginning and the APT at the end. And stage one is really about getting clear on where we're at now. So the first day is accept and acknowledge, and that could be about accepting our situation. If we're in a situation we're not happy with, do we want to continue in a situation we're not happy with? So it's about accepting where we are, thinking about where we got here from, and acknowledging that we might need a change. But it could also be accepting who we are, accepting and acknowledging who we are. And if that is, I've had to accept and acknowledge that I have ADHD, and that means that I'm not maybe who I thought I was before. Or it could be accepting what we can and can't control. So it's all about, that kind of
good
acceptance.
Foundation. Yeah.
And once you've accepted that, the next bit is the D. The first D will define, what do we want? If we don't want this, what do we want? And I know you've just done your NLP, I think, haven't you?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
So you'll have you'll be familiar with the idea of away from and towards goals.
Yes.
And I think so often we get stuck in what we don't want and not going forward to what we do. And I don't know if Bev still does the analogy of kind of having a bungee rope tied around your middle with what I don't want fence behind and what I do want fence in front. And of course, when we're aiming towards what we do want with this bungee cord, the tension from what we don't want is getting stronger. It's pulling us back. So the define is about what do we want to work towards and how can we keep moving that fence forward to keep tension on the pull to pull us forward.
Yeah, makes sense.
The second D, design. Okay, now we've defined it. Let's design it. What do we want it to look like? How are we going to get what we want? What do we need to do? Who do we need to work with? Who do we need to talk to? Who do we need to get help from? What credentials might we need that we don't have? So it's kind of the design stage.
So not letting it happen, choosing to design what that future will be.
Absolutely, taking responsibility and control about the outcome and not just letting it happen. It might also be about, okay, what do I actually need to do? If I don't want to do what I'm doing now, and I want to start my own business, but I still need an income, it might be simple things like, okay, I need to design how I'm going to put enough savings aside so that when I can drop what I'm doing now, I'm not left in the lurch. It's not, you know, which is difficult for us with ADHD because that means planning and we're not great at that. So that's stage one, really, the define, the acknowledge, design and define the way around. And then the apt bit is the actionable bit. It's the making it happen. So the third A, too many A's, is about activate. This is about you've got your design. Right, what do we need to do now to put it into action, to actually get things started? What first steps can we take? It might be registering for self-assessment or, setting, registering a business, your business. Okay. It could be opening a bank account, just tiny, small steps that actually get you out of that thinking stage. Because I'm sure you'll know this from the amount of people you've coached. We can sit in the design stage for a long time.
Waiting for perfect.
Never moving into activate. So the activate is about, okay, we've done enough of the defining and the designing. Now let's actually put some small steps in place.
Very solid.
The P is about progress. That's about consistency, continuing what you've activated, putting your systems in place, your processes in place. It's about getting out there with some offers, selling them, marketing them. It's the business stuff. It's that progress. It's actually doing what you say you're going to do. And the final T is the test and review. So we've been doing this a while. Is it working? Is it still what we want? And actually that could be daily, weekly, your quarterly planning. It could be your annual review. It could be a 5-year plan. And the beauty of the ADAPT, I think, model is that it's not just a business model. It's a life model as well. If you wanted to put it towards, I could desperately do with losing weight, for example. If you want to lose weight, well, where am I now? Acknowledge where I am and what do I need to do and go through that process. So it's iterative, you do it.
It's actually a good coaching model that could be applied to pretty much any situation.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that came to me. Shall I let you into a secret? Came to me in the shower.
Did it?
Yeah. Most of my best ideas do. But so I've started a Facebook group called the Adapt Women's Network, which is specifically for women with ADHD who are very new to business as a support network and an opportunity to help them to sort of share their business, I guess, and get hints and tips. And it just all feels like it's fallen together. So I just need to go and trademark it now. That's my next challenge. And I'm definitely in the design stage, and I haven't moved to activate because I don't know how you trademark something.
So let's just to wrap it up, Bev. I mean, it's been fascinating insight into not only your journey, but generally the idea that it's a real condition that people do have. It's a trait, and not symptoms. I get that. When that was a bit of a revelation for me. If there are people watching who are thinking, this is really resonating with me, what are you recommending as a next step for them?
I really do think strongly about whether a diagnosis would help. I get that not everybody's can afford it, and it's a long wait on the NHS. But go and do some research, and if a diagnosis is going to help validate You know, I think that's really important. You don't need a diagnosis to find a coach, and I'm not suggesting work with me. I'm not actually an ADHD coach. That's not my thing, but there are some brilliant ADHD coaches out there who can potentially help with things like putting in strategies and systems to help with productivity and managing, you know, some of the problem, the areas that we struggle with. So I think it comes back to that accepting and acknowledging. What do you need to do to get to the point where you accept who you are? And if that means a diagnosis for validation or just accepting it yourself and taking responsibility, well, what am I going to do with this? I think, it's a difficult one because we're all going to be coming at this from a different place. Yeah,
for sure. And I'm thinking, as you say, just recognizing that if you do think that these things are resonating with you, is not to sit on it, but to actually go and just get some help.
Yeah. And don't see it as a stigma. I think that's the main thing. Things are changing. I think it feels a little bit like everybody is talking about ADHD now, which is how it felt about menopause 5 years ago. And in some ways, I feel as if ADHD and neurodiversity is the next kind of big thing coming in, especially in the workplace. You know, businesses would do very, very well to recognise that if they've got people with ADHD in their business, they're not a liability. They could have an amazing asset. Tap into those entrepreneurial tendencies. We talk about intrapreneurship, don't we? And you know, using those strengths for their innovation and creativity and tapping into that and not seeing it as a problem. So I do think the whole sort of neurodiversity, ADHD thing, there's much, much more to neurodiversity than just ADHD, I know, but I think it is kind of the next stage that businesses need to be looking at.
Good. Well, look, it's one of those topics that could go on forever and ever and ever, but we're going to have to call it a day there. Bev, I'm really appreciative of you taking the time to come and see me, and I know this is going to be valuable for a lot of the people watching. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.